Like the sirens of Greek mythology, Cuba has long called across the sea with a bewitching song. The swing of Xavier Cugat, the style of Desi Arnaz, the beat and bounce of a rhythm that promised a swinging rum-fueled time that was somehow, almost magically, just a famous 90 miles away. Until 1959. The communist revolution, ushered in by Fidel Castro, changed it all. The toys were put away, and the playground was closed until further notice. If you didn't like it, you could leave, but you would leave with nothing more than the shirt on your back. And more than 1 million Cubans did exactly that, bitterly disconnected from their possessions, their homes, and all that they held dear. The United States soon answered with a punishing embargo, and in many ways, time stood still. Cuba became a North American Galapagos, hermetically sealed against the winds and erosions of time. And that turned out to be an amazing thing for Detroit. Havana, Cuba is 90 miles from the United States, but that geographic sliver has been no match for the political chasm of the last 50 years. Hi, and welcome to sunny and hot Havana. I'm Devin Scillian. It is hard to imagine anything being very frozen here, and yet the Cold War that has existed between the United States and Cuba has finally started to thaw. That may be great news for the Cuban people. It may be bittersweet for those who love the time capsule nature of Cuba, because we came here and found Havana 313. You know the world's great cities at a glance, but is there any place more readily identifiable than this? One look around and you can only be in Havana, Cuba. Yes, it's the Spanish colonial architecture. It's the famous Malecon, the walled, winding road along the sea, but it's the cars that are the giveaway. Until just a few years ago, Cubans could only own pre-revolution era cars, which pretty much meant rides that were more than 50 years old, some much older. And that makes Cuba the most extraordinary Detroit showroom in the world. You know before you arrive that you're going to see some great old classic cars. You may be unprepared for the volume of them. They are just everywhere. Now, some are old beaters that seem to defy the laws of physics. Some look to be about one pothole away from spontaneous combustion. And then, around a corner comes one that makes you go weak in the knees. Welcome to Cuba. Today, if you talk about a Cuban, you can mean anything from a cigar to a sandwich, or maybe you're talking about any one of the 11 million souls who have been, in essence, trapped. Yes, stranded on a tropical island. But if you're an American, Cuba comes preloaded with so much software. At one time, the Soviet Union had 150 nuclear warheads parked on this island. And for 13 days in 1962, it felt like they were locked and loaded.
This sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country.
In the Cuban Missile Crisis, 3 nations felt they were being slapped across the face. It left a mark, all right, and it stung for decades. There were very real issues and concerns. One of the safety valves of the Cold War should have been that the U.S. and the Soviets were at least divided by oceans, but Cuba was the Soviet satellite in American orbit.
I think they sense that there is. It is true that the security apparatus grew enormously over the years. Especially, listen, I don't think anybody can ever sufficiently underline how much the United States tried to do things here in Cuba in the 60s. Assassination attempts, terrorism, you name it.
But the tensions between the U.S. and Cuba grew to be so outlandishly acute that the CIA reportedly once worked on a plot to target Fidel Castro with a depilatory substance that would make the hair of his beard fall out. And yet, there was much for Americans to love about Cuba. Even President Kennedy struggled with the policy's practical ramifications. Hours before signing the embargo into law, he ordered his press secretary to go out and buy every H. Upmann Cuban cigar he could find. He managed to come up with 1,200 of them, by the way. More than half a century later, the sabers don't rattle quite as loudly. One Castro has been replaced by another, but the clock is ticking.
10 years we will have a different Cuba.
So do we have what we've
with
seen?
no Castro president.
The American flag now flies over the embassy reopened this summer. And now, here the island sits, with its cigars and its rum, its music and art, its parades that defy you to try to sit still. And of course, its cars. Each one of them a rolling Detroit museum.
When I tell people I'm from Detroit, they know right away, oh, the auto capital. And I say, yeah, absolutely. And they say, you've seen our cars. I said, yeah.
Say what you will about the maize and blue, it is hard to miss in a crowd. And that's how we found Christian Bashi, a U of M grad traveling the world on a fellowship, a trip that he wanted to begin in Cuba.
I think it's fantastic. This place is beautiful. The people are extremely kind and welcoming. There's little crime, and I feel safe here. And it's really a great travel destination. And
Christian was loving it, but he was also understanding that things are difficult here. Goods can be hard to come by, and it's hard to miss that things have fallen into some disrepair.
But it's something that can be jarring sometimes when you see some absolutely beautiful buildings, but in complete disrepair. And sometimes it can be startling.
It is. And Christian isn't the first to see a little Detroit in Havana. Not just the cars, but the fight to restore a city's former glory, to build a future as promising as the past that is so evident and splendid even in the decay. But the cars. Yes, goodness, the cars. They will send a Detroit heart sailing, even though many of them have their own quirks and foibles. It is great riding in these old vehicles, but you're struck by a couple of things. Number one, there is not a seat belt in sight, never mind an airbag. Number two, in many of these rides we've had, we're surrounded by the smell of gasoline. And that's because on these old models, the access point for the fuel tank is so easy to get to that in a place like Havana, people will siphon away the gas and steal you blind. So most of these old vehicles, they've retrofitted them so that the gas access point is in the trunk, which of course means that inside the vehicle, you're left with this rather strong smell of petrol. Trifling concerns, I suppose, against the chance to be ferried around Havana in an old Detroit chariot. They truly don't make them like this anymore.
It's really awesome. Honestly, I don't get to see these cars every day in Detroit, let alone here in Cuba. So it's really ridiculous and really cool, actually, and seeing people repair them all the time. I'm walking down the street and I see these people are really crafty, and they're making these cars work and last for a really long time, and they function well, and they use them as taxis. So I've actually been in them, and in Detroit, I haven't even been able to be in these cars. But here in Cuba, I have the opportunity.
You had to come to Havana to ride in a Detroit.
That's true. It's pretty crazy, right?
Anyone with an old car will tell you they come with one big problem. They tend to break down. Well, if yours breaks down in Havana, we got a guy, and you'll meet him when Havana 313 continues. For years, coming up with a great idea for a startup business in Cuba was a fairly worthless exercise. It's difficult to express how hard a sell capitalism has been for the Cuban regime. When Fidel Castro came to power, he was so fiercely opposed to a capitalist economy, he ordered all monopoly board games to be destroyed. You weren't going to put a hotel on Boardwalk, and don't even think about owning a railroad or the electric company. And as long as Fidel Castro was in power, that seemed the ironclad Cuban way. But in the switch from Fidel to Raúl, it's become clear the new Castro has ideas of his own. And that's working out pretty well for Julio Alvarez. Julio! ¿Cómo estás? Gracias, señor. Julio runs a business in Havana called Nostalgia Car. It is a great name, but the operative phrase of the sentence is runs a business, something new to the Cuban lexicon. Julio owns a fleet of immaculate old Chevys and Fords that give tourists the cushy Havana cruise they've dreamed of. How different, and this may be difficult to explain, but how different is the new Cuba he's talking about from the old Cuba?
No es difícil de explicar.
It's not very difficult to explain.
I simply think this is a Cuba with more possibilities for Cubans.
One of Julio's drivers is John Edel, a former English teacher who helps translate. But he's for Julio. Let us note that the cars seem to speak for themselves. Walking around the nostalgic car garage is like hanging out at the drive-in from American Graffiti. Imagine if he could just set up shop along Woodward for the Dream Cruise. But there's an important distinction between the cruisers of the U.S. and the drivers of Cuba. I point out to Julio that in the U.S., owners of these old beauties often take them out only on weekends or for special occasions.
Yo tuviese que dejar de usar mis clásicos en Cuba, porque fueron solo los fines de semana, creo que me moriría.
Well, in fact, I think that's the beautiful thing about Cuba is that these are not special occasions. People are living in their lives with these cars in a very real, everyday way. Julio sold one of his prized cars so that he could buy this garage and set his business sailing, or cruising. He then had just enough money left over to buy this 1937 Ford Coupe, nearly 80 years old, but would you believe it's today his everyday car. Oh, baby.
Baby, yes. Power 37.
And this octogenarian vehicle is my first glimpse at the extraordinary ingenuity wrought by an embargo that makes parts nearly impossible to come by. This is also where purists may blanch, but frankly, to complain about the way these cars are kept running misses the point entirely. Sometimes you have to find suitable recipe substitutions. So, while Cuba has long symbolized the bitterness between the United States and Russia, this vehicle is proof that the two countries can work together. This is a Russian radiator and a Russian carburetor, but an original 1937 Ford Coupe engine purring like a kitten. The changes in the Cuban system mean that Julio's passion is now his occupation. But the fuse was lit on that passion long ago.
Mi papá, antes del 59, trabajaba para la General Motors en Cuba y desde que yo tenía 8 años me enseñó a trabajar la mecánica. Al principio fue un hobby con 8 años, pero cuando tenía 13 ya me empezaba a molestar, porque ya era obligado a trabajar los fines de semana. Ya no podía salir con las novias, tenía que trabajar. Y un poco que aquello me molestaba mucho, ¿no? Pero hoy lo extraño mucho.
But today I miss him a lot, and I thank him.
Me emociona cuando hablo de él.
I really get emotion when I talk about him.
Especially when he's around this 1955 Bel Air, the Chevy that's been in his family since 1961. The cars that pretty much started his life have now given him a new chance at life. And his wife, Nidiales, too, though it wasn't an easy sell.
Cuando aquello mi esposa no estaba tan apasionada como estaba yo con los clásicos. Casi me cuesta el divorcio porque dejé la casa sin economía. Pero al final recuperé toda la plata cuando terminé mi coche. Hoy es la dueña de la compañía. Siempre le tengo que estar pidiendo dinero.
Well, he said he's the heart and you're the brains.
Yes, yes. Yes, it's true.
Their fleet has grown to 22 cars, but they're always looking to add more, especially since at any given time, one has to come out of service for a shave and a haircut. The car looks fabulous to me, but Julio says it's been on the street for 5 years since its last overhaul. So next week he again will take it off the road to refurbish, which is by now a refurbish. In fact, thanks to the salty air and the rust that it creates, cars need to be completely stripped and repainted every 2 to 5 years here. But paint is just a small part of what you might call Cuban magic. With so much commerce wrapped up in these vehicles, when mishaps occur, they manage to get them back up and running with breathtaking quickness.
So John was telling me, you remember the blue Impala from yesterday?
Yeah, of course.
It was in a wreck last night. But they had it fixed this morning and it was back out on the road. Just like that.
There are lots of water tank trucks working here in Havana, and one of them hit in the back.
How many miles are on these cars? Well, you don't need a translator when he's trying to explain that the odometer stopped working long ago.
Yo le puedo decir que ya los odómetros no funcionan. Yo cuando los restauro, los vuelvo a poner en cero, me parece que están acabados de comprar.
Start over.
Yes!
And you don't need an odometer to know that these old cars have tallied well over 1 million miles. So what is the secret to keeping a car running for 50, 60,
80 years.
¿Cuál es el secreto de mantener un carro tantos años andando?
La necesidad.
Necessity, he says. Simple as that. And watching that mother of invention at work is a beautiful thing. It can be hard to appreciate the handiwork that you're seeing here. Even a spot-on nameplate that you assume is original may have been conjured out of a simple piece of aluminum.
Right down to the logos. They would remake the logos.
Everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
A few more trips around the garage, and I slowly began to understand what I was seeing. This old ride needs an entire new rear panel. There is no way to order one, no secondary market to shop. Julio has only one choice. He's got to make one.
He's making these starting from scratch? Just taking sheet metal and turning it into...
Turn into this.
You're basically running your own car factory.
Dice que tiene una fábrica de carro. Tú haces eso aquí.
Your own assembly line.
From there. From there.
From that to this. Yeah, yeah.
Pero esto es increíble porque esto es sin recursos, sin herramientas.
Because you have no machinery, no tools to make this.
Esto con un martillo, un sincero y buscando un...
On that table, the shit table is got
That's insane. I'm blown away. I had no idea.
From a piece of sheet metal, his miracle workers will bend, pound, and shape a smooth new piece that will look like original American steel by the time it's welded, sanded, and painted. It's even crazier than it looks. Julio has no measured drawings, no molds, no stamping operations. Don't even ask about laser cutters or a 3D printer. So,
how are we creating the exact shape of the parts to match the original?
¿Cómo crea la forma original de la pieza para que...
Ahora te lo voy a... Si me esperas un segundo te la traigo para que veas.
If you wait a second, it's going to bring it so you...
Yeah, I'd love to see.
What he has is a catalog from a California parts dealer.
So he's taking the picture in the catalog and recreating it?
Exactamente. Por la foto, tomamos las medidas, lo llevamos a una escala y la fabricamos.
And from the pictures and rough specs, they will make it so.
Somos artistas.
We're artists.
Sí, artista.
I was, and am, blown away. But eventually, we left the garage behind for where these babies really shine, the streets of Havana. This ride would turn plenty of heads at home, that's for sure, but it gets plenty of approving looks here, too.
Cuando tú andas en un clásico restaurado por Nostalgic Car, todos los cubanos te miran, todos los extranjeros te miran, es increíble la satisfacción que se siente. Nadie calcula eso. Me gusta disfrutar mi pasión, pero realmente que me reconozcan mi trabajo también me gusta mucho, ¿entiendes?
While I was asking Julio to describe the feeling of driving this great 1959 Impala, he asked me what it was feeling like to ride in it.
I love the feeling of this. Gives me nostalgia, gives me Detroit pride. My grandfather used to drive an Impala.
Really?
So it makes me feel warm about my grandfather. It's a very emotional experience, isn't it?
Wow.
Further proof that these are meant to be driven? Well, imagine throwing the keys to your dream ride to someone you've only known for a few hours. Julio pulled over and put me behind the wheel of his licorice black beauty.
You trust me, right?
Yes.
Trust? Okay.
Dream cruisers, of course, already know what this is all about. The memories, the feel, the very solid essence of the thing. The bench seat took me back to my old Dodge Dart.
You know, we don't get to do this anymore with American cars. That seat's gone. It's just all bucket seats now. Can't stretch out and really enjoy the thing. Really, really need to be able to stop for a milkshake.
A real thrill for me, but in a way I came to understand it was a thrill for Julio too. Julio told me not to get out of the car until he could come around to my door, because he has a ritual he shares with those lucky enough to drive one of his chrome and steel wonders.
Okay, my friend. My car is your driver.
We're brothers now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you are driving my baby.
Oh, it is a baby. It's beautiful.
Julio's been lucky enough to make several trips to the United States, but he hasn't yet made it to his Bethlehem.
Y de todos los viajes que he dado a los Estados Unidos, al único estado que no he podido ir es a Detroit. Me encantaría porque ahí está la historia del automóvil real. Ojalá tener esa posibilidad.
You couldn't come to Detroit, but Detroit has come to you.
Yes, the Detroit cars have come, and he's hoping that a warming U.S.-Cuba relationship will allow more Detroiters to come to him too. Of course, real classic car aficionados might take issue with the mix-and-match configuration of Cuba's cruisers, and Julio is well aware.
Eso es real.
That's real.
Yo ojalá pudiera tenerlo lo más real al
I
original.
wish I could have all the cars as close as the original.
Y por eso agradezco a Obama lo que está haciendo por aperturar las relaciones con Cuba, porque creo que es la oportunidad que tenemos.
I thank Obama for what he's done in activating the relations with Cuba.
Porque es la oportunidad que tenemos los cubanos, que somos apasionados por esto, de conservar, mejorar estos carros clásicos y tratar de llevarlos a su versión lo más original
And
posible.
that possibility Obama is trying to give us is the best thing for us Cubans, passionate Cubans for these cars, to bring these cars back to the original way they were.
Yeah.
When I told Julio that many of the Cuban immigrants in the United States are not happy with President Obama's decision, Julio shrugged and told me,
Los que estamos aquí sí.
Well, the ones here, the Cubans here, we are very happy with it.
Y creo que hay que estar aquí para hacer cambiar esto, no hay que estar allá, sino aquí.
Los guaracheritos de regla.
Cubans seem to need very little encouragement to throw a party. If you come expecting only misery and downtrodden faces, you're in for a surprise.
What do you suppose is the biggest misconception that Americans have about Cuba and Cubans?
I think people in the States probably think Cuba is a closed society, and it's not.
Father Gilbert Walker reminds me that while the U.S. has posted a keep out sign around the Cuban borders, Cuba has not. While the U.S. has been so conspicuously absent from the island, that is not to say that it has been without visitors. It has long been a popular vacation spot for Canadians. In fact, many Americans over the years have bypassed the U.S. embargo by simply hopping a Cuba-bound flight from Canada. Europeans and those from Central and South America also make their way to Cuba for its wealth of culture and sunshine. And there is plenty of both. Music lovers rightfully see Cuba as a singular destination. If you're into music, Havana is a kind of heaven. Rare is the restaurant or bar that doesn't offer some form of live music. It is everywhere. Pamela Ruiz is a rarity, an American who willingly moved to Cuba 2 decades ago. She's married to Cuban artist Damien Aquiles. His art fills their lovely home, where she often hosts dinners for those trying to learn about Cuba's electric art scene. I ask her about the intersection of life and art here.
Well, I think that it's interesting because it's almost like the way that's phrased and the way people look at it is as if there's a separation. In Cuba, culture is part of your life. There's just no separation. I mean, what it plays in, everybody goes to the theater. My son is 18. He has a girlfriend that's Cuban, and she's 16. And when I say, where are you going? We're going to the theater. I'm like, really? I should be doing a little bit more of that. So there was never, that's one thing I think that separates the way that Cubans perceive culture in the United States, is that in the United States it's a privilege. In Cuba it's a birthright. So the idea that you go to a museum and would not be able to afford because you have 4 children just wouldn't happen in Cuba. It's for free.
Free. Free is an interesting word to use in Cuba. Free. Free education, free health care, and yet an island of people who were not truly free. Soon, as a visitor to this city of so much art and music and beauty, you come face to face with some hard truths. As a world political philosophy in 2015, communism is on life support. But one of the few places left where you can still detect its pulse is Cuba.
George Orwell's novel Animal Farm is about an egalitarian society gone wrong, and he notes that all are equal, some are just more equal than others. There are some people who live very well here in Havana, but they don't live here in one of the many barrios where life is just hard.
The barrios of Havana can provoke a lot of thought. I walked through desperately poor neighborhoods, foul-smelling, frequented by hungry, homeless dogs. The average salary in Cuba is about $20 a month, and the people who live here don't even have that. And yet, they have access to full health care. They can all read. The literacy rate in Cuba is among the highest in the world. And while there are problems with petty theft, there is almost no violent crime. So, no struggles with finding a doctor, going to school, or worrying about gunfire, and yet no liberty either. I'll leave it to you to decide whose poor people are better off. But getting people to talk about those hardships is difficult. I found that in many of the interviews I conducted in Havana, I heard two versions of a story. One for me and my camera, and another for me when the camera was off.
One of the things that has been a little bit of a conundrum for me is a number of the people that I've interviewed. They tell me one thing on camera, and then they're far more honest with me off camera. They admit to me that they can't really speak their mind on camera. That's a tricky thing for a journalist to try and, it's difficult for me to use the comments of people that I know aren't telling me necessarily the truth, but there's still, I guess, a fear among a lot of Cubans that somebody's listening to them all the time.
It is true that at times you get into trouble when you talk. I have found that myself. I have gotten into trouble many times, but I have gotten out of it because I simply don't have a second agenda. I think people overblow that.
People ask me on my return to the U.S. if the government had someone following me around during my visit. No, we were on our own, but I've come to understand that in a way, the government was right there with me. One cab driver who did not want to be interviewed told me it's best to keep a low profile here. One of the people who I did find to be almost startlingly honest was Heidi Oliva, an art history professor in Havana. At 25, she's part of that young arts culture which is so strong here, but she also clearly longs for more.
What are the things that you spend your time wishing and wanting for yourself?
For myself, I want to have an art gallery. Any day, I don't know. I have to write about art. Well, that I do now, yeah. But the gallery thing, no.
Yeah.
Art business in Cuba is very complicated.
Yeah.
This is, I think, another talk for another day.
Heidi dreams of going abroad to further her education, but it's a dream with a hefty price tag. Even as a university professor, she makes that average Cuban salary of just about $20 a month.
You make $20 a month, but you need probably how much a month to live?
I don't know. If I do the math, I maybe figure out that I am living with most money that I made. I don't know how I do that.
And you're very well educated, and you're in a you're in a university position.
Yeah, I am.
Do you think you're being paid what you're worth?
Do you really want to ask that?
It's an insulting question.
Yeah.
It's a wistful conversation. From her $20 to being part of the real-world economy seems like a moonshot to Heidi. And yet her knowledge of Afro-Cuban art does hold potential for her. The Cuban art scene is booming, hot at the moment. And it's what's bringing many well-heeled visitors to the island right now. And tourism remains the golden ticket that habaneros know can make their lives better.
Well, John, tell me a little bit about your car.
Well, I've had this car for 6 years. I bought it, and now I'm working with the car, and that's my way of living.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Is it?
It is. 1955?
1955.
1955 Ford.
Yep.
John Edel is one of those who's turned to tourism. We hired his car for the morning.
What do you say we take it for a spin?
Well, sure.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
As a former English teacher, John's English is exceptionally good, though I nearly tripped him up on cruiser vernacular.
Use the word, you almost got me there. There in the question you asked me? You said something, let's go for a spin or something.
Oh yeah, yes.
Wow.
Let's take it for a spin.
Yeah, you almost
got you?
You almost got me there, man.
John may not know what a spin is, but he knows how to take me for one. He drives me to Revolution Square, the center of political pageantry in Havana, the site of many a May Day parade. But it's also a hot spot for the city's sweetest rides.
I was going to say, you've got a little competition for the nicest car up here, don't you?
Yeah, I know. All the cars that come here.
John was yet another Cuban I met who believes the end of the American embargo could be a rainmaker for him. Easier to get parts to keep this beauty humming, and easier for Americans to come to Cuba to ride in it. But I did find myself wondering what, if anything, would that do for Heidi Oliva. She needs more change than that.
Yeah, we all have to make that decision in one point, I think. This is my country. I love my country. I love my culture, cultura, I don't know if it's a culture. I love, even I love that my country represents sometimes. I love, we are a great country, I think. And we have things that are pretty good, the education, the health.
Healthcare, yes.
Yeah, it's good, it's very good, but the life is not only that.
It's not enough.
No, it's not enough. Of course, it's not enough.
This gorgeous setting is Hotel Nacional. It is drop-dead gorgeous, and this historic piece of Havana's past is actually a glimpse of its future. What it could be if it really opens up to American tourists. What is ahead for Cuba? We'll tackle that when Havana 313 continues. It spoke volumes when Pope Francis decided the first stop on his North American trip should be to Cuba. He had been a key bridge builder between Cuba and the U.S., of course, but it was also a reach into a nation that has been an outlier among its Latin brethren. From Spain to Mexico, from the Philippines to Tierra del Fuego, the world's Spanish-speaking nations are generally joined by not only language, but by the Catholic faith. And then there's Cuba. Cuba isn't officially an atheist nation, but communism has long been connected to the opinion of Karl Marx, who insisted that religion was the opiate of the masses.
We are not similar to other Latin American countries where the church has so much influence. In Cuba, they don't.
True, but as you walk around Havana, you see that it's in the DNA of the place, right? The old Spanish, I mean, there's beautiful churches and cathedrals here. The trappings are there.
Yes, but we don't have a tradition of practicing Catholicism.
Indeed, with its deep Spanish colonial history, it is not difficult to find a church in Havana, but it is a little more difficult to find regular attendees. For a Latin nation, you meet quite a few people with a rather jarring indifference to faith. No, it is not Mexico, nor Brazil, but it's not even the wandering Catholic of its neighbor 90 miles to the north. We met Heidi Oliva earlier. I asked her about the upcoming papal visit.
Next month? Does it matter to you?
No, not really.
No?
I am not Catholic.
She says she wants change in Cuba, but she seems doubtful that it comes through faith.
The Papa can come or not, I don't know.
It was fascinating watching the preparations for the Pope's visit to Revolution Square. Think about it. The Pope would implore Cubans to connect with their faith under the intense stares of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. But Havana was, at the same time, preparing for another visitor that many felt carried far more influence.
I love that. Wow.
The arrival of Secretary of State John Kerry meant the opening of a different kind of church, the American Embassy. With its promise of American visas and perhaps, eventually, an end to the punishing embargo, it offered its own brand of salvation.
No soy católico.
He's not Catholic.
Not Catholic?
No tengo idea de cuán bueno puede ser para mi negocio y para mi vida.
If it's good for his business, if it's good for his life, he's got no idea about it.
Hoy, más importante veo la apertura de la embajada americana en Cuba, la visita de John Kerry.
Today is much more clear the visit of John Kerry and the opening of the embassy here in Cuba.
Y la posibilidad de que quiten el embargo.
And the possibility that finally the embargo is lifted.
Without an official presence in Cuban life, the church is oddly absent from some of the trappings of what we tend to view as modern life. For example, it's not unusual at all to meet a Cuban who tells you he's been married 10 or 11 times. because here the idea of marriage is more of a living arrangement than an official religious commitment ceremony. So there are a few things to figure out when you visit. Life in Cuba, as you know by now, is terribly complicated. Basics are provided to all, and yet that may depend on your definition of basics. One day you can't find butter to put on your bread, the next day you can't find bread to put under your butter. And it's here in the barrios of Cuba where you can find an American priest who found his calling.
And you, as a priest, you've been here 12 years, and you choose to be here.
I actually asked for this assignment.
Yes, Father Gilbert Walker asked to work here in a poor neighborhood in a communist country. And that's why he feels so energized by a pope who's placed so much focus on the world's poor.
Pope Francis is challenging the church in lots of ways to break out of an institutional model and to go and be with the people in a different way. Instead of waiting for people to come to church, he's inviting the church to go to the periphery, the edges of society, the margins.
Welcome to the margins. This is where Father Walker keeps his focus. And now, to have a pope whose focus is likewise calibrated, the priest feels connected to his faith in a way he hasn't before, perhaps. While Cuba has had papal visits in the past, Father Walker feels an opportune moment has arrived.
Pope Francis has a very special way about him. He's engaging, he's got a good sense of humor, he speaks his mind with lots of freedom, and I think that's very refreshing. I think Latin Catholics find him refreshing as well.
This Pope has two advantages. He's Argentinian, therefore he's Latin American, and he has been involved in normalizing relations with Cuba. Plus, he's the Pope of the poor. So there are three more reasons for him to be more accepted in Cuba.
In fact, accepted in a most unlikely place. Several people mentioned to me the recent quip about the Pope made by the Cuban president, Raul Castro.
Raul apparently said recently that he's thinking of becoming Catholic again.
He said if the Pope keeps up his way of speaking, he's going to come back to church and start praying again.
Raul is a very interesting case because he has shown at several moments in his life that he can be a believer. So I wonder.
Some of the faith that you find being practiced in Cuba is not Catholic, at least not all Catholic. Walking down the streets of Havana, you frequently see someone dressed completely in white, including a head covering. They're going through the year-long initiation into a faith called Santeria, a blend of Catholicism and Afro-Cuban tradition. The faith includes many of the saints and traditions of the Catholic Church, but they're given different names and mixed into practices that many Catholics wouldn't recognize.
The Santeria experience doesn't have Christian content, but it does use Christian symbols. And it has to do with the times when slaves were brought over from Africa and were baptized, but really weren't evangelized.
Para nosotros lo mismo, San Francisco Asís, es Orula.
Our cab driver on our last day in Havana turned out to be a Santeria believer, and he took us to his church, Our Lady of Charity. As he explained it to me, when Catholicism was thrust upon newly arrived slaves, they adopted the new saints, but they kept the African saints hidden behind them.
No tiene que ver mucho con mi religión, pero sí, es algo trascendental.
But what would really transcend in Cuba is relief from the isolation that has, at the same time, created and stunted the modern Cuba, which is why this moment meant more to many Cubans than a religious visit.
Having normal relations makes it easier for us to talk.
It's hard to describe just how extraordinary this scene was. American secretaries of state have delivered remarks in countries big and small all over the globe, but you've been far more likely to see one of them deliver a speech in the Australian outback than on the island of Cuba.
I think most people, most international relations specialists, thought of the Cuba-U.S. situation like frozen in time, that it will never, ever change.
Until this hot day in August.
And talk can deepen understanding even when we know full well we will not see eye to eye on everything.
It's very funny because I have been working on this since the 1960s, okay?
Dr. Carlos Azugaray is a former Cuban diplomat who says he felt the thaw starting to stir in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected. But the waxy buildup of time can be suffocating.
So I have been, in many occasions, we have had this idea, things are going to happen, and then nothing happened. So we were accustomed to that kind of thing.
Now, opening an embassy should not be confused with lifting an embargo. Many Cuban Americans are adamant that the U.S. cannot give in to a nation that, despite its reforms, remains stubbornly communist. That's why it isn't as simple as raising a flag or opening a building. The disagreements have been deep, wide, and painful. A newly opened embassy that clearly has its work cut out for it. About 200 yards from the embassy stands this statue. Now, there's some dispute over its exact comment on the Elian Gonzalez case, but the message is clear. He's saying you cannot take our children, and he's pointing directly at the United States Embassy. Other issues continue to vex the two sides. Guantanamo remains open, but to Cuba it's more of an open wound. Every month, the U.S. sends Cuba a $4,000 check as a rent payment for Guantanamo, and every month, Cuba refuses to cash the check. But a number of Cubans told me they hope the world can see that changes are coming. They may be slow, but they're coming. That Raul his leadership has been quite different. You've got people now able to own their own businesses. You've got people that are on Airbnb. You've even got Uber now, which I don't know if we're going to call it Cuba or whatever, but there's an opening up of the idea of private enterprise that hasn't been here before. Do you sense, is that overselling it a little bit, or is it different?
I can't sell it enough. I think that the difference between Fidel and Raul was that at the very end of Fidel's government and his overseeing the government in Cuba, I think he became more conservative to the prospects of change. I think like what happens to people as they get in their twilight years. I think that Raul being the head of the army, had a closer identification with what was happening on a daily basis with Cubans in general.
Having watched President Obama change American course here, Cubans will now be keeping a very close eye on our presidential race. The new future that they sense is just within their grasp could well hang in the balance. One must imagine that where Cuba is concerned, a Hillary Clinton presidency would be a very different thing from, say, a Marco Rubio White House. But eventually, change will happen at the top in Havana, too.
We are about to be witness of the biggest and most significant generational transition in Cuba of power from the older generation to the younger generation. So the United States faced a choice of saying what to do. These guys who are going to take over from 2018 on, these guys who were born in the late 50s, early 60s, the only United States that they have learned is the one blockading them. So you have to do something if you are going to have ever a capacity of dialogue with those people.
If these changes seem too slow for you, well, hold on. Modern-day Cuba was built on the idea and promise of a revolution, El Revolucion. I think you could argue another one is taking place in Cuba today, but it looks like this. The story coming up. How can Cuba be so close and yet seem so remote? This isn't some far-flung atoll in the South Pacific. It's not even next door. It seems to be in the United States' backyard, and yet it has been strangely disconnected.
I don't know, man. The picture people pay 2, 3, 4, 5 hours. I know you don't know people don't know
everything everywhere. Water is a problem here. I think you realize.
Oh man, this is
Wi-Fi? You tried getting online? Cuba is one of the least wired nations on the planet. It's estimated only about 5% of the population has access to the internet. Perhaps the World Wide Web isn't quite worldwide after all. But that is changing. No touristy hotel for American traveler Karina Castellanos.
Oh, everything's online, so it's pretty easy. Everything's online. Airbnb.
You staying in an Airbnb?
Yeah. So it's not like they're behind on internet, so they use Airbnb.
But that's even Airbnb has arrived in Cuba. Our visit came at a time that seemed to crackle with possibility. Still plenty of billboards about El Revolucion, but I was fairly certain I was watching a new El Revolucion right before my eyes. At night, young people crowd around the Wi-Fi hotspots along 23rd Street. Now, this has only been allowed for a few months, and look at the crowds, the young faces lit up by phone and tablet screens. I've long felt that the world's most important resource is information, and right now the habaneros who can are devouring it as quickly as the occasionally rickety signal will allow. Now, keep in mind, no one in Cuba was allowed to even own a cell phone until 2008. And by the way, your American phone will not work here.
I really wish I could use the internet here. It's something I'm really used to in the United States.
Tough news for traveler Christian Bashi.
I'm always, going on Instagram or Twitter, and that's something I can't do here. But I really wish I can contact my family, let them know that I'm safe and stuff like that. And I can't. It's hard to believe that this is a reality, that a lot of people don't have access to these things.
As a young, digitally connected American, Christian knows that social media can create connections in speedy and saturating ways, especially where there's already common ground.
Even though we live in seemingly completely different worlds, we share a lot in common in terms of our interests. They play the same video games as I play, they just don't play them online. That's the difference. And they find ways to get them.
They find ways, which may be the real story of Cuba. Now, you can't get everything on the web in Cuba. It is heavily censored, but you can get on Facebook. And despite its reputation of glorifying the trivial, like I'm brushing my teeth now, if you can get on Facebook, you can learn a lot about what's going on in the world.
Yes, even FaceTime has come to the streets of Havana, but getting online is still very complicated here. To find internet access, you need a Wi-Fi access card, and getting a hold of one of these is not nearly as simple as you might expect. In fact, when the taxi cab driver helped me get this card from a guy on the street, it felt like a very illicit deal.
Because of that, we gave Christian one of our Wi-Fi access cards, and off he went to reconnect, in essence, sending up a flare from the dark side of the technology moon. Getting by without email is one thing if you're Christian. It's quite another if you're a business considering moving to Cuba.
But you're exactly right. If you don't have access to sending information back and forth, you're kind of shut down, and nobody wants to be shut down.
How poised is American business to jump into Cuba? Well, consider Dana McAllister. She heads the Michigan office of the Cuban Chamber of Commerce. She's hoping to clear the path for Michigan businesses to get into the game here. And of course, tech is part of it.
5 years ago, you probably wouldn't even have thought about creating the Cuban Chamber of Commerce, but things are changing quickly, aren't they?
And yes, definitely, at lightning speed.
So quickly, in fact, that those who love Cuba have to wonder, what will all of that change cost? How long can Havana remain Havana?
Well, are you ready for the day, though, when there's McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken and Pizza Hut all over the place? Not everybody.
I don't think that day is coming anytime soon.
No?
No, I don't. I think that Cuba has had a lot of time to see what's happened in other places. And I think that they're very well educated, they're very disciplined, they're very industrious, and they're not about to sell their land and their souls to the highest bidder.
But of course, everyone has their own sweet spot.
I have been known to eat at McDonald's when I travel, although I prefer Wendy's. And now that I go to the United States, there's a new chain called Panera. Panera is a little bit over.
There you go.
Yeah, Panera is good. I think this idea is not a bad idea. These are franchises. Maybe Cubans can have franchises. I would try to produce a Cuban sandwich. Cuban sandwich is much better than a McDonald's. But anyway, I like Starbucks. I don't have a problem with Starbucks. Some people complain. It's funny because some people will tell you Walmart is terrible. Then they travel and they buy everything at Walmart's. I hear people who complain about Home Depot. I would like to have a Home Depot in Havana.
Right now there is scaffolding surrounding the Capitol building here, and it feeds perfectly into the metaphor because this government, this city, this nation is changing. But how long is that change really going to take? How much gas is left in the tanks of these great old Detroit miracle machines that roam the streets here? Because Cubans know that change can come in a revolution, no doubt, but it can also take a long time. The joke here is that Fidel Castro has actually been dead for years. He just doesn't realize it yet. Thanks so much for watching. For producer Ro Coppola and photographer William Damas, I'm Devin Scillian. Adios y nos vemos from Havana.